Chapter 17, the Endocrine System, Part 1. So, the endocrine system is a diverse collection of glands, organs, and cells, and the thing that links all of them is that they produce hormones that coordinate body activities. So, every structure in the endocrine system produces hormones of some kind. There are also some other non-endocrine organs that do produce hormones, but for various reasons aren't included in the endocrine system. So glands. Glands are a group of epithelial cells that make and secrete substance. Exocrine glands, as we know, have a duct going to a surface, and the things they secrete end up going out to the surface, such as saliva and sweat and gastric juice. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, do not have a duct. They do not go to a surface. Instead, they secrete hormones, and these hormones are released directly into the bloodstream or into the tissue fluids, the interstitial fluids surrounding the gland, which often then goes into the bloodstream. So, the endocrine gland can be stimulated to release its hormone by three different stimuli. One is humoral stimulus. Humoral stimulus is change in conditions in the bloodstream. So some glands keep an eye on what's going on in the bloodstream, and if conditions change, that will cause them to release the hormone to then re-establish the proper levels of whatever substance this is, such as glucose or calcium or so forth. Neural stimulus. Neural stimulus is a direct signal from the brain tells the gland to secrete its hormone. So neural stimulus, direct nerve impulse. And then finally, hormonal stimulus. Hormonal stimulus is when hormones produced by some other structure causes the endocrine gland to release its hormones. So you can have a cascade where the hypothalamus produces hormones causing the anterior pituitary gland to secrete a hormone that causes, say, the thyroid gland to secrete a hormone. So hormonal stimulus. The master controller of the endocrine system is said to be the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, as we know, is part of the brain, part of the diencephalon. And what the hypothalamus does is it controls the release of hormones by the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus is viewed as the major integrating link between the nervous system and how it controls the body systems and the endocrine system and how it controls and regulates the body's functions. The pituitary gland is actually two separate glands that are housed in the same area. So we have the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. Two structures, the same area, two roommates, one apartment. The hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland by secreting hormones. The hypothalamus will produce releasing hormones that will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release hormones. And the hypothalamus can produce inhibiting hormones that suppress the release of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. Now, when one endocrine structure produces hormones that cause another endocrine structure to do something, those hormones are called tropic hormones. So the releasing and inhibiting hormones the hypothalamus produces are tropic hormones because they're causing another endocrine structure, the anterior pituitary gland, to do something. The anterior pituitary gland produces 7 hormones. One hormone is growth hormone. Growth hormone is the hormone that controls the release of growth factors all throughout the body. This hormone is key for the growth and development of infants and children into their mature adult size. So it's the growth hormone that helps to control and regulate that process. Then we have the thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone, by surprise, stimulates the thyroid gland in our throat to release some of the thyroid hormones. So, for instance, here's the hypothalamus. It releases thyroid stimulating hormone, releasing hormone. The releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary gland, causing it to produce the thyroid stimulating hormone. That hormone then goes into the bloodstream, travels all over the place, and finally makes it to the thyroid gland. There, the thyroid stimulating hormone causes the thyroid gland to produce its thyroid hormones. Two sets of tropic hormones, the ones coming from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, and the ones coming from the anterior pituitary gland and going to the thyroid gland. And then when thyroid hormone levels in the bloodstream are optimal, the hypothalamus will switch to the inhibiting hormones to stop the anterior pituitary gland. All right, moving on. We have the follicle stimulating hormone, which we talked about in the reproductive system. Follicle stimulating hormone in the ovaries initiates the development of follicles of egg cells in the ovaries, and in the testes stimulates the production of sperm. So both males and females have follicle stimulating hormone controlling the development of their gametes. Then we have the luteinizing hormone, also talked about in the reproductive system. Luteinizing hormone in the ovaries stimulates ovulation and also the production of estrogen and progesterone by the luteinizing corpus luteum, by corpus luteum. And then the luteinizing hormone in males stimulates the production of testosterone. So luteinizing hormone does have a function in males as well. Prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone that promotes milk production in the mammary glands. So it goes and produces, it gets started getting released at the end term of a woman's pregnancy so that her mammary glands will be ready to produce milk that the infant will need. Then there's the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Sounds like a big word, but really it's just saying what it is. Adrenal cortex. So it is causing tropic hormone, causing release of hormones by the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex, tropic hormone, production of hormones by the adrenal cortex. And then we have the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulates the pigment cells in skin to produce skin pigmentation. So they stimulate the darkening of skin. Also seem to have some other function in the brain that is not very well understood. So these are the 7 hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Learn them, live them, love them. So which of these are tropic hormones? Well, thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone because it stimulates the thyroid gland to produce the thyroid hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone is also a tropic hormone because it stimulates the production of estrogen in the ovaries. Didn't say that earlier, but it's true. And the luteinizing hormone is also a tropic hormone because it stimulates the production of estrogen and progesterone in the ovaries and testosterone in the testes. And finally, adrenocorticotropic hormone is also a tropic hormone. It's in its name, tropic hormone, because it causes the release of hormones by the adrenal cortex. Pituitary disorders. If someone has a hyposecretion of human growth hormone, that means they're producing very little human growth hormone, then that will lead to someone who is significantly shorter than expected, and is referred to as pituitary dwarfism. These individuals are perfectly symmetrical. All their structures are the right size relative to each other. It's just they're noticeably smaller than expected. And then the other extreme, giantism. Giantism is the hypersecretion of human growth hormone. So extremely large amounts of human growth are produced, and the person becomes significantly taller than expected, and there are some negative health consequences associated with that, usually including a shortened lifespan. And we're talking about really, really tall, 8, 9, 10 feet. Pretty dramatic. All right, moving on to the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland does not produce hormones. Posterior pituitary gland instead stores 2 hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus has specialized structures that will produce the hormones and send them directly to the posterior pituitary gland. Then the hypothalamus will tell the posterior pituitary gland when to release these hormones by neural impulse. These 2 hormones are oxytocin. Oxytocin is important. It stimulates the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. So it stimulates the myometrium, the smooth muscle tissue in the uterus. And it also stimulates milk ejection, so the release of milk in response usually to when the infant is suckling. Turns out the oxytocin is also often called the cuddle hormone or the trust hormone because it seems when at higher levels to cause people to trust each other, to care about each other more. So men do indeed produce this hormone, and yeah, it's a pretty cool hormone. The second hormone stored in the posterior pituitary gland is the antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone's job is to conserve body water. So it is released when there is low blood pressure, when blood volume is decreased. And what it does is it goes to the kidneys and causes the kidneys to decrease urine volume. So the urine being produced is much more concentrated. The kidneys trying to conserve as much water as possible. And it also leads to decreased perspiration so that less water is lost through the skin. All right, moving on to the thyroid gland, this sort of butterfly-shaped gland found in the throat underneath the thyroid cartilage or Adam's apple. This gland produces two categories of hormones. It produces the thyroid hormones. The thyroid hormones are important because they control and set the basal metabolic rate. So the higher levels they're at, the faster the person's basal metabolic rate is. So it does things like stimulates protein production, increases the use of glucose, accelerates body growth, and so on. So if someone's said to have a super fast metabolism, they probably are producing higher levels of thyroid hormones. And this, of course, is all controlled by the anterior pituitary gland and its production of the thyroid stimulating hormone. Second category of hormone is the calcitonin. Calcitonin is released when the thyroid gland detects that the calcium levels in the blood are too high. So if calcium levels in the blood are too high, calcitonin is released with the goal of lowering calcium levels in the blood. To do this, the calcitonin goes to bone tissue and stimulates the osteoblasts. I'm sure you remember from earlier in the semester, osteoblasts are the cells that build up bone tissue. When they build up and the bone tissue, the calcium is removed and phosphate is removed from the bloodstream and deposited into the bone tissue. So by increasing the activity of osteoblasts, it increases the removal of calcium from the bloodstream. Parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands are four of them. These little nodules are on the posterior or back side of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid glands release the hormone parathyroid hormone. And the function of the parathyroid hormone is to increase blood calcium levels. So the parathyroid glands are keeping an eye on calcium levels in the bloodstream. If the calcium levels are too low, then the parathyroid hormone is released. Parathyroid hormone will stimulate the activity of osteoclasts. Again, as I'm sure you remember from earlier in the semester, osteoclasts are the cells in bone tissue that break down bone tissue. Osteoclasts break down the bone tissue, causing the release of calcium and phosphate. So, if there's low levels of calcium in the bloodstream, parathyroid hormone will stimulate the osteoclasts. They will break down the bone tissue. That will release calcium into the bloodstream, raising blood levels of calcium. All right, this is where we will stop with this part of the lecture.